At 7:10 in the evening on November 10th, 1975, a man named Captain Ernest McSorley picked up his radio and spoke 4 words to the ship, trailing 10 miles behind him. "We are holding our own," and then the Edmund Fitzgerald disappeared. No distress call, no mayday. No warning of any kind, just 4 words, and then silence, and then a blip, vanishing from a radar screen, somewhere in the darkness of Lake Superior 17, miles short of safety, with 29 men aboard the ship that sent that final transmission was 729 feet long. It weighed more than 13,000 tons. When empty, it was the largest vessel ever to sail the Great Lakes when it was launched, and it remains to this day the largest ship ever to sink there. It had spent 17 years setting hauling records, breaking its own records, hauling millions of tons of iron, ore across the same waters. It would die, in and in all that time, in all those crossings, through all those November gales. It had never once come close to being lost until the night it was gone, in seconds. But to understand what happened on November 10th, 1975, you need to go back much further than that. You need to understand what the Edmund Fitzgerald was, what Lake Superior is, and what the November of 1975 brought to those waters, and why 4 words, "We are holding our own," became the most haunting final transmission in the history of Great Lakes shipping, the SS. Edmund Fitzgerald was not named after a sailor or a navigator or a maritime figure of any kind. She was named after the president and chairman of the board of the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a man named Edmund Fitzgerald, who ran that corporation from 1948 until 1958, when the ship that bore his name was launched. It was the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company that had commissioned the vessel, conceived as a business investment, a bulk or carrier that would generate returns by moving iron ore from the mines of Minnesota to the steel mills of Detroit and Toledo, and the lower Great Lakes. The company spent $12.5 million building her, and when she was ready to be christened on June 7th, 1958, at the Great Lakes Engineering Works in River Rouge, Michigan, things did not go smoothly. The champagne bottle swung at the bow and did not break the first time it swung again, and did not break a second time. It took 3 attempts before the bottle finally shattered against the hull, and one of the spectators in the crowd that day died of a heart attack during the ceremony, and the ship itself initially refused to move properly into the water, requiring significant effort from the yard crew to get her launched, and the sailors and the longshoremen who were there that day, being a superstitious breed, took note of all of this. They took note, and they remembered it, years later when everything went wrong. But once she was in the water, none of that seemed to matter, because the Edmund Fitzgerald was extraordinary. She measured 729 feet in length, with a beam of 75 feet and a depth of 39 feet 6 inches. She was powered by a single Westinghouse steam turbine, generating around 7,500 shaft horsepower, driving 1 propeller, and capable of reaching a full speed of about 16 miles per hour. She could carry an enormous cargo of taconite pellets, the marble-sized balls of processed iron ore that were the lifeblood of the American steel industry, and she had been designed with a level of comfort inside that was almost remarkable for a working cargo vessel. The interior had been fitted by the J.L. Hudson Company with tiled bathrooms, deep pile carpet leather swivel chairs, and porthole drapes. The crew quarters had air conditioning. There were 2 dining rooms served by a fully stocked pantry and a large galley. The pilot house had a map room and advanced navigation equipment, and there were 2 guest staterooms for company passengers, who were treated to candlelight dinners with mess-jacketed stewards and a special punch. The captain arranged. Once each voyage, she was, by the standards of any working vessel on any body of water in North America, a remarkable ship, and she proved it immediately. Once in service, she was nicknamed the Big Fitz and the Mighty Fitz, and enthusiasts gathered along her regular routes to watch her pass. She set seasonal hauling records and then broke them again 6 times over 17 years. She did this in 1964. She became the first ship on the Great Lakes to carry more than 1 million tons of ore through the Soo Locks. In a single season, she was celebrated, she was famous, she was the pride of the American flag, as the newspapers called her a ship that people who had nothing to do with the shipping industry knew by name and came out to see. She was commanded over those years by a series of captains. But the man who would take her on her final voyage was Ernest M. McSorley, a 63-year-old sailor from Toledo, Ohio, who had been navigating the Great Lakes and the ocean for over 40 years. He had commanded 9 ships before the Fitzgerald, and had taken command of her specifically in 1972. He was known by everyone who worked with him as quiet and highly professional, a man who treated his crew as capable adults and expected professional standards. In return, he had a particular reputation as an excellent heavy weather captain, a man who did not panic and did not make rash decisions when conditions deteriorated. He was also, as November 1975 approached, planning to retire at the end of the shipping season. This voyage, this run from Superior, Wisconsin to the steel mill on Zug Island near Detroit, was supposed to be close to his last. The crew of 29 men that sailed with him that November were a cross-section of the working maritime world of the Great Lakes. Most were from Ohio and Wisconsin, men who had made their lives on these ships and these routes. John Simmons was the senior wheelman, a 63-year-old from Ashland, Wisconsin, who had been friends with Captain McSorley for more than 30 years. He was known as a storyteller and a jokester, and the trip was going to be one of his last before his own retirement. He was survived by a wife named Florence, who never dated or remarried after his death. Eugene O'Brien was a wheelman from Toledo, Ohio, who had been sailing since he was 16 and was nicknamed the Great Lakes Gambler for his love of cards and casinos. Carl Peckle was just 20 years old, a watchman from Ashtabula, Ohio, the youngest member of the crew. Nolan Church was a porter from Silver Bay, Minnesota, who had not started sailing until his 40s, after watching the freighters go by his home and deciding it looked like interesting work, his son Rick later recalled. His father joking that the Great Lakes did not have a hole big enough for the Fitzgerald. These were not strangers to the water. They were not novices facing their first crossing. They were experienced professional sailors who had seen bad weather before and believed as their captain, believed as their ship itself seemed to have proven year after year that the Fitzgerald could handle what the lake sent against her. They were wrong, and the lake that would prove them wrong was not going to give them any warning. Before it did. Lake Superior is the largest of the Great Lakes. By surface area, it covers nearly 32,000 square miles and reaches depths of over 1,300 feet. It is cold in ways that are not fully captured by numbers. The average water temperature in November is somewhere around 34 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to cause incapacitating hypothermia in minutes, cold enough that the Lake Superior region has a particular phrase attached to it that Gordon Lightfoot would later put into a song. Superior, they said, never gives up her dead, and it is not merely poetic, it is meteorological and biological fact. The water is cold enough and deep enough and dark enough that bodies of people who drown in Lake Superior are frequently never recovered. The lake does not return them. The pressure, the temperature, and the depth conspire to keep them. And it had been keeping them since long before November 1975. Between 1816 and 1975, the Whitefish Point area of Lake Superior alone had claimed at least 240 ships. That is not the total for the whole lake. That is one area, a stretch of water that the Fitzgerald was trying to reach on the night she disappeared. The Great Lakes as a whole average one vessel lost every single week. Between 1875 and 1975, 100 years of maritime disaster at a rate that would be considered catastrophic in any other body of water in the world, and these losses were accepted as a cost of doing business because the ore had to move, the steel had to be made, the ships had to sail. The culture of the Great Lakes shipping industry in 1975 was one in which sailing through difficult conditions was not considered reckless. It was considered professional. It was what you did. Storms came in November, and November was the last stretch of the shipping season before ice. Close the locks, and every cargo delivered before that happened was money that mattered. Ships were expected to go storm or not, as maritime historian Fred Stonehouse later put it, and the Fitzgerald and her captain and her crew were products of that culture, completely and without reservation. The storm that would kill the Fitzgerald began forming on November 8th, 1975, as a low-pressure system over the southern plains of the United States. It was not immediately alarming by November. Great Lakes standards. The National Weather Service initially predicted it would pass south of Lake Superior, and the forecast on the evening of November 9th. When the Fitzgerald departed Superior, Wisconsin, was for conditions that were challenging but not extraordinary. Gale warnings were issued for Lake Superior, but gale warnings were not unusual in November. The winds were expected to reach perhaps 60 miles per hour, and waves were predicted at around 16 feet, and captains who had spent their careers on these waters had seen worse than that and continued their voyages. The final voyage of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald began at 2:15 in the afternoon on November 9th, 1975, at the Burlington Northern Railroad dock, number 1 in Superior, Wisconsin. Captain McSorley had loaded her with 26 Bianon 16 long tons of taconite ore pellets, enough processed iron ore to produce roughly 7,500 automobiles. The destination was the steel mill on Zug Island near Detroit, a journey of approximately 750 miles. She departed on schedule and almost immediately fell in with a second vessel, the Arthur M. Anderson, a 647-foot bulk carrier under the command of Captain Jesse B. Bernie Cooper, which had departed Two Harbors, Minnesota. That same afternoon, bound for Gary, Indiana. The two ships made radio contact and agreed to travel roughly the same route. The Fitzgerald, being the faster vessel, took the lead, with the Anderson following somewhere between 10 and 15 miles behind. They were in regular radio communication. Throughout the early hours of the voyage were not alarming by 1 a.m. on November 10th. The ships had altered course northward toward the Ontario shore, seeking the protection of the Canadian coastline as the storm developed and the Weather Service revised its warnings upward. The Fitzgerald reported winds of 52 knots and waves of about 10 feet, manageable for a vessel of her size. Captain McSorley was running at speed. He knew his ship. He had done this before, but during those early morning hours of November 10th, the storm was doing something that the Weather Service had not fully predicted. It was intensifying far beyond its initial forecast, rather than tracking south of Lake Superior as originally predicted. The low-pressure system deepened and turned and came directly across the lake. The two separate high-pressure systems converging with it created conditions that the NOAA would later analyze as producing some of the most violent localized weather ever recorded on Lake Superior winds in the southeastern portion of the lake where the Fitzgerald was headed, exceeded 50 miles per hour across most of the area by 7 p.m., with gusts measured well above, that the Arthur M. Anderson recorded hurricane-force winds of 75 knots. At one point, waves were building throughout the day, reaching estimated heights of 25 to 35 feet. By evening, these were not rolling ocean swells. These were Great Lakes waves, short and steep and closely spaced, arriving with violent frequency, giving a ship almost no time to shed the water. From one wave before the next, one was crashing over the bow. At around 3:30 in the afternoon of November 10th, Captain McSorley came on the radio to Captain Cooper of the Anderson and what he said made clear that things had become serious. "Anderson, this is the Fitzgerald," he said. "I have sustained some topside damage. I have a fence rail laid down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list I'm checking down. Will you stay by me till I get to Whitefish?" Cooper responded immediately, "Charlie on that." "Fitzgerald, do you have your pumps going?" "Yes, both of them." McSorley said this exchange is important because of what it reveals. The Fitzgerald had a fence rail down, meaning structural damage on deck. She had lost or damaged 2 vent covers, meaning openings, to the interior of the ship were now compromised. She had developed a list, meaning she was leaning to one side, indicating water ingestion, and McSorley was slowing down. Checking down in maritime language, asking Cooper to stay close, and asking for radar guidance. What it also reveals is what McSorley did not say. He did not say, "I am in danger." He did not say, "I need rescue." He did not declare an emergency. He asked for company and for radar help, and he kept going, because that was the culture, and because the Fitzgerald was the Fitzgerald, and because Whitefish Bay was still reachable, and because he had been doing this for 40 years, and he believed they could make it. At around 4:10 p.m, the situation became more complicated. The Fitzgerald lost both of her radars, both of them simultaneously leaving her essentially blind in a storm on a lake she could no longer navigate independently. McSorley called the Anderson again and asked them to keep track of them to provide radar guidance so the Fitzgerald could continue toward Whitefish Bay without being able to see what was ahead. This was a serious development, and it became more serious shortly afterward when the US Coast Guard broadcast a warning that the Soo locks had been closed due to weather and that all ships should seek safe anchorage. The locks being closed meant that even if the Fitzgerald made it to Whitefish Bay, she could not proceed further immediately. But Whitefish Bay still offered shelter from the worst of the open lake, and that was what McSorley was heading for around 5:30 p.m. A radio exchange took place between the Fitzgerald and another vessel, a saltwater ship called the Avafors, that had just come through Whitefish Point and was heading in the opposite direction. On that exchange, McSorley's words were not calm. The Avafors reported receiving the Whitefish light and asked about conditions where the Fitzgerald was, and what came back from the Fitzgerald was unmistakable distress. McSorley shouted, "Do not let nobody on deck," and then told the Avafors, "I have a bad list, lost both radars, and am taking heavy seas over the deck. One of the worst seas I have ever been in." One of the worst seas I have ever been in, those words. From a man who had spent 40 years on these waters, who had captained 9 ships before this one, who had driven the Fitzgerald through November gales for 3 years. Those words mean something. They are not the words of a man who has not seen bad weather. They are the words of a man who is telling you that what is happening around him right now is beyond his previous experience. Throughout the late afternoon and evening, the Anderson continued to track the Fitzgerald by radar, providing navigational guidance as the ship she could no longer see, her own way pushed towards Whitefish Bay. Captain Cooper and his crew watched the blip on their screen. They talked to McSorley. They tracked his position. They watched him moving towards safety, and they believed he was going to make it. They were only 10 miles behind him. At 7:10 p.m, the Anderson made radio contact with the Fitzgerald for the last time. A mate on the Anderson asked McSorley how he was making out with his problem, and Ernest McSorley spoke the last words ever heard from the Edmund Fitzgerald. "We are holding our own." The Anderson lost radar contact with the Fitzgerald almost immediately afterward, not because of mechanical failure, but because of what radar operators call sea return, the intense clutter of massive waves filling the screen with noise and obscuring everything within it. The Anderson crew watched their screen and waited for the Fitzgerald to reappear, and she did not reappear. The mate tried to raise her on the radio. There was no answer. Captain Cooper tried the radio himself. There was no answer. By 7:25 p.m, Captain Cooper was calling the Coast Guard. "We are very concerned with the welfare of the steamer. Edmund Fitzgerald." He told them he was right in front of us. Experiencing a little difficulty, he was taking on a small amount of water, and none of the upbound ships have passed him. I can see no lights as before, and I do not have him on radar. I just hope he did not take a nosedive. He had taken a nosedive somewhere between 7:10 and 7:15 p.m. on November 10th, 1975. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald went to the bottom of Lake Superior in Canadian waters, 530 feet deep, approximately 17 miles northwest of Whitefish Point. She could have covered that distance at full speed. In just over an hour, she was 17 miles from shelter when the lake took her. The sinking was almost certainly instantaneous. The way it happened left no time for anything. The Coast Guard investigation later concluded that the cargo rushed forward. The bow ploughed into the lake bed and the midship structure disintegrated, allowing the stern section emptied of cargo to roll over and override the other structure, finally coming to rest upside down atop the collapsed middle section. The lifeboats were not launched. They were torn from their storage racks by the force of what happened. That means the crew had no time to reach them, no time to attempt any kind of escape. The ship went from underway to destroyed in seconds. 29 men died. No distress call was ever sent. No mayday. No emergency signal. Nothing at all, just silence where the Fitzgerald had been. The Coast Guard initiated a search that night, in conditions that made any rescue operations nearly impossible. The Arthur M. Anderson itself turned back into the storm at the Coast Guard's request to search for the Fitzgerald Cooper, and his crew went back into the weather that had just swallowed the Fitzgerald to look for survivors. They found debris. They found 2 lifeboats badly damaged. They found miscellaneous wreckage from the surface, but they found no bodies and no survivors, because there were no survivors on November 14th, 1975, 4 days after the sinking. A United States Navy Lockheed P-3 Orion aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant George Connor, located the wreck using its magnetic anomaly detector, a device designed to find submarines by detecting disturbances in the Earth's magnetic field. It found the Fitzgerald on the floor of Lake Superior in Canadian waters, close to the international boundary, and subsequent survey by underwater vehicles confirmed that the ship lay at a depth of 530 feet, broken into 2 main sections. The bow section and the stern section separated from each other, with the debris of what had been the middle of the ship scattered between them. In May 1976, an underwater recovery vehicle was deployed to photograph the wreck, and what it found confirmed the catastrophic nature of what had happened. The ship had not merely sunk, she had been destroyed. The 2 sections lay hundreds of feet apart, and the stern section was upside down, just as the Coast Guard's analysis had suggested. No bodies were ever recovered from the Edmund Fitzgerald. The cold, deep water of Lake Superior and the conditions under which the ship sank made recovery essentially impossible with the technology of the time. In 1994, nearly 20 years after the sinking, a remotely operated vehicle filming the wreck discovered a body near the bow. The figure appeared to be dressed in overalls and a life jacket, relatively well preserved by the frigid water, but the wreck had by that point been declared a protected grave site under the Ontario Heritage Act, and the remains were left undisturbed because families of the crew had specifically requested that the site be treated with the respect owed to a place where 29 people died, and those 29 people are worth knowing by name. Ernest McSorley, the captain from Toledo, Ohio, planning his retirement, John McCarthy, the first mate from Bay Village, Ohio, James Pratt, second mate from Lakewood, Ohio, Michael Armagost, third mate from Iron River, Wisconsin, George Hall, chief engineer from Cabot, Pennsylvania, Edward Binden, first assistant engineer from Fairport Harbor, Ohio, Thomas Edwards, second assistant engineer from Oregon, Ohio Russell Haskell, second assistant engineer from Millbury, Ohio, Oliver Champeau, third assistant engineer from Milwaukee, John Simmons, the senior wheelman from Ashland, Wisconsin, who had been McSorley's friend for 30 years, Eugene O'Brien, the Great Lakes gambler from Toledo, John Poviech, wheelman from Bradenton, Florida, Ransom, Cundy watchman from Superior, Wisconsin, William Spengler watchman from Toledo, Carl Pecol, the youngest at 20 from Ashtabula, Ohio, Thomas Borgeson, maintenance man from Duluth, Minnesota, Bruce Hudson, deckhand from Olmsted Falls, Ohio, Mark Thomas deckhand 21 from Richmond Heights, Ohio, Paul Ripper, deckhand 22 from Ashtabula, Robert Rafferty steward from Toledo Nolan Church, porter from Silver Bay, Minnesota, who thought the job looked fun and whose son remembered him joking. The lake did not have a hole big enough for the Fitzgerald Blaine Wilhelm Euler from Moqua, Wisconsin, Ralph Walton Euler from Fremont, Ohio, Thomas Campbell Euler from excluding David Weiss, a 22-year-old cadet from Agoura, California, and several others whose details are part of the permanent record of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society. These men ranged in age from 20 to 63, from a retired gambler who had sailed since he was 16, to a young cadet on what was essentially the beginning of a career. Most were from Ohio and Wisconsin. Most came from lake communities where the shipping industry was woven into the fabric of ordinary life. They were ordinary men doing an ordinary job on a ship that should not have been able to sink. The question of why the Edmund Fitzgerald sank has never been definitively answered and may never be. It is the central mystery of the whole story, and it has generated more books and studies and investigations and arguments than almost any other maritime disaster in American history. The official investigation produced two separate official conclusions that contradicted each other. The United States Coast Guard conducted a Marine Board of investigation and concluded that the most probable cause was flooding through the hatch covers. The Fitzgerald's 21 cargo hatches used a type of cover that had to be manually secured, and the Coast Guard found evidence that the covers had not been properly sealed before departure, or had been damaged by the storm, allowing water to enter the cargo hold steadily throughout the day as the storm worsened. Water in the hold could not be detected because there was no monitoring system for water in the hold. The crew had no way to know how much water was below them until it was already too late, and once enough, water had entered the cargo section and saturated the taconite pellets. The weight shifted forward, the bow dipped, and the rest happened. In seconds, the National Transportation Safety Board conducted its own investigation and reached a different conclusion. The NTCSB believed the most likely cause was that the Fitzgerald had struck the bottom near Caribou Island, a shoal area that the ship passed through during its altered course. The navigational charts the Fitzgerald was using were based on surveys conducted in 1916 and 1919, and a 1976 survey after the sinking revealed that those charts did not accurately show the full extent of the 6-fathom shoal. In that area, the UNTSB concluded that the Fitzgerald may have grounded briefly on that shoal, damaging her hull and allowing water to enter from below rather than from the hatches above. Beyond these two official theories, other investigators and maritime historians have proposed additional factors and combinations of factors. Some believe the ship was struck by what are called the Three Sisters, a phenomenon unique to the Great Lakes in which 3 massive waves arrive in rapid succession. The first sweeping across the deck before the ship can recover, the second hitting before she can drain the third, overwhelming whatever is left. This phenomenon is documented on the Great Lakes and is known to be capable of overwhelming even large vessels in extreme conditions. Others have argued that the ship had structural weaknesses from years of heavy loading and may have broken apart while still on the surface before ever reaching the bottom. Others point to the load line, the measurement that determines how deep in the water a ship can legally ride, that had been raised 3 times since the Fitzgerald was launched, allowing her to carry heavier cargoes and sit lower in the water, making her decks more vulnerable to wave wash. The truth is probably not any single one of these factors in isolation. The truth is probably a combination, a ship that was being pushed hard in conditions that exceeded what anyone had predicted, that may have sustained hull damage near Caribou Island, that was definitely taking water faster than her pumps could manage, that lost her radars and lost her ability to navigate independently, that was 17 miles from safety when something tipped the final balance. What is certain is that she went down without warning, without a distress call, without any signal to the outside world, that she was in her last moments. Captain McSorley had been on the radio regularly for hours before the sinking, reporting his problems, asking for guidance, expressing the difficulty of the conditions, and then in the space of a few minutes between his last transmission and the moment Captain Cooper realized she was gone, the Fitzgerald simply ceased to exist as a surface vessel and began her permanent life 530 feet down on the floor of Lake Superior. The aftermath of the sinking reverberated across the Great Lakes shipping industry and the wider American public in ways that the loss of a cargo vessel in a November storm might not ordinarily have done. The tragedy drew national attention. The families of the 29 men had to be notified, and many of them found out not from official channels, but from news reports and phone calls from other sailors' wives. The community of Great Lakes, maritime families, is a small and interconnected one, and grief travelled through it. Quickly the Coast Guard held public hearings, and the testimony of Captain Cooper, of the Anderson, and others who had been in radio contact with the Fitzgerald in her final hours was vivid and specific and heartbreaking. Captain Cooper, who had watched the blip disappear from his radar screen, lived with what he had seen for the rest of his life. He gave his last major interview before his death in 1993 and described the sinking as sudden and catastrophic, and said he never stopped thinking about the crew. In 1976, Canadian singer Gordon Lightfoot released a song called The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and everything changed, not in terms of the investigation or the official record, but in terms of how many people knew this story and carried it with them. Lightfoot had read an article called The Cruelest Month, published in Newsweek in November 1975, and had been deeply affected by what he read. He researched the story and wrote the song quickly, and it became one of the most successful songs of his career, reaching number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. It is 6.5 minutes long, almost unheard of for a commercial pop song in 1976, and it tells the story of the final voyage in a ballad style that somehow manages to be both historically accurate and genuinely moving the line. Superior, they said, never gives up her dead. When the gales of November come early, has become as embedded in the public consciousness as almost any lyric in American popular music. The song did something unusual for a pop hit. It made people care about maritime history. It made people care about the men who sailed the Great Lakes. It made people call the Great Lakes dangerous and beautiful in the same breath, and it ensured that the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald would never be merely a footnote in the shipping logs. It would be something people heard on the radio and felt something about and wanted to know more about. In 1978, the Great Lakes shipwreck, Historical Society was founded in part as a direct response to the Fitzgerald disaster by divers, teachers and educators who wanted to document and preserve the history of Great Lakes. Shipwrecks. The Society conducted expeditions to the Fitzgerald wreck in 1989, 1994 and 1995, and on July 4th, 1995, a joint expedition with the National Geographic Society, the Canadian Navy Sony Corporation and the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians recovered the Fitzgerald's 200-pound bronze bell from the wreck. The recovery was requested by the families of the crew, who wanted a memorial that could be seen and touched, and the bell was brought up from 530 feet and restored, and is now on permanent display in the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point, Michigan. When the bell was recovered, it was replaced at the wreck site with a new bell on which the names of all 29 crew members are engraved. A bell that sits in 530 feet of cold, dark water as the only monument that marks where those men died. The wreck itself is now protected under the Ontario Heritage Act and has been since 2006, following years of unregulated expeditions, including the 1994 discovery of the body near the bow. Anyone who dives to the Fitzgerald without permission from Canadian authorities faces a fine of up to $1 million Canadian dollars. The families of the crew fought for that protection. They fought for the right to have the place where their fathers and husbands and sons died, treated as what it is, a grave, and they won. The questions the Fitzgerald raised about safety on the Great Lakes led to changes in regulations. Though those changes came slowly and with significant resistance from the shipping industry, the Coast Guard proposed requirements for watertight bulkheads in Great Lakes vessels which would allow a flooding ship to remain afloat long enough for rescue or evacuation. The Lake Carriers Association, which represented the fleet owners, fought those requirements, arguing they would cause economic hardship, and those arguments prevailed for many years. Most Great Lakes vessels operating today still cannot prevent flooding of the entire cargo hold area. If the hull is compromised, the Fitzgerald changed some things, but it did not change everything. 50 years on the story of the SS, Edmund Fitzgerald remains the most famous and the most debated maritime disaster in Great Lakes history. It is debated not only because the cause is unknown, but because the mystery feels meaningful, because a ship that was that large and that capable and that experienced going down in the way it did, without any warning, without any chance for the crew to act, speaks to something fundamental about human beings and the natural world, about the limits of technology and experience and confidence and design in the face of conditions that simply exceed everything. The Fitzgerald was not a poorly built ship. She was not under-maintained. She was not sailing in conditions that no ship had ever survived. Before she was a celebrated, record-breaking vessel, captained by a highly respected, experienced professional, surrounded by a crew who knew their jobs, and she went down in minutes without sending a single signal. That is the thing that stays with you when you study this disaster. It is not just the scale of the loss. It is the silence, the 4 words we are holding our own and then nothing. The men on the Anderson watching the screen, waiting for the blip to reappear. The families listening to the radio. The Coast Guard dispatcher taking the call from Captain Cooper. I just hope he did not take a nosedive, the absence of any warning, any chance, any moment where anything could have been different 17 miles from Whitefish Bay, and safety 17 miles that the Fitzgerald could have covered in just over an hour at full speed, and somewhere in those 17 miles, Lake Superior decided that the gales of November had come early enough, and that the mighty Fitz had made her last run. The bell rings 29 times every November 10th at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point, Michigan. Once for every man who went down with the Fitzgerald, and after each ring a name is read aloud. Ernest McSorley, John McCarthy, James Pratt, Michael Armagost, George Holl, Edward Bindon, Thomas Edwards, Russell Haskell, Oliver Champeau Ransom, Cundy William, Spengler, Carl Peckle, John Simmons, Eugene O'Brien, John Poviich, Paul Ripper, Mark Thomas, Bruce Hudson, Thomas Borgeson, Robert Rafferty, Nolan Church, Blaine Wilhelm, Ralph Walton, David Weiss and the others, whose names are on that bell on the bottom of Lake Superior 29 names, and the lake that will not give them back, and a song that will not let us forget, and a question that will never be fully answered, and 530 feet of cold dark water, where the largest ship ever to sink on the Great Lakes still lies, broken in two pieces exactly where November 10th, 1975 left her. We are holding our own 4 words, and then silence, and that silence has lasted 50 years.